Have you ever wondered how a teenage concubine could rise from complete obscurity to become the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor? Well, the answer isn't luck or even political marriage. Instead, Wu Zetian mastered a deadly game of palace intrigue that would make modern politicians look like amateurs. Systematically eliminating rivals and manipulating 3 different emperors to claim ultimate power. So in this soothing journey through ancient China, I'm going to reveal how Wu Zetian transformed from a powerless servant girl into the most feared ruler in Chinese history, using her intelligence, ruthless ambition, and perfect timing. This remarkable story spans decades of palace conspiracies, family betrayals, and political murders that would reshape an entire dynasty. What I'm going to do is walk you through her incredible rise to power, and by the end of this series, you'll understand exactly how she achieved the impossible. Now, to truly appreciate Wu Zetian's rise, we need to understand the world she was born into. The year was 624 CE, during the early Tang dynasty, when China was experiencing a golden age of prosperity and cultural achievement. The Tang capital of Chang'an was the largest city in the world, home to over 1 million people from dozens of different cultures and kingdoms. Merchants traveled the Silk Road, bringing exotic goods from as far away as Persia and Rome. Buddhist temples stood alongside Taoist shrines and Confucian academies. Art, poetry, and scholarship flourished under imperial patronage. But beneath this glittering surface lay a society built on rigid hierarchies and absolute male dominance. The Confucian social order placed the emperor at the top, followed by government officials, farmers, artisans, and merchants. Women existed outside this hierarchy entirely, defined solely by their relationships to men as daughters, wives, or mothers. A woman's highest aspiration was to bear sons who might bring honor to the family name. The concept of female ambition was not just discouraged, it was literally unthinkable. Wu Zetian was born into this world as Wu Zhao, the daughter of Wu Shihuo, a wealthy timber merchant who had supported the Tang dynasty during its rise to power. Her family background was unusual for someone who would later enter the imperial court. Most concubines came from established aristocratic families with generations of court connections. The Wu family, while prosperous, were essentially nouveau riche merchants, looked down upon by the traditional nobility who traced their lineages back centuries. Wu Shihuo had 3 wives, as was common for wealthy men of the era. Wu Zhao's mother, Lady Yang, was his second wife, which placed Wu Zhao in a precarious position within the family hierarchy. She was legitimate, but not the primary heir. She had older half-brothers from her father's first wife, who would inherit the family business and properties. This early experience of competing for attention and resources in a complex family structure would prove invaluable training for the even more treacherous world of imperial politics she would later navigate. From her earliest years, Wu Zhao displayed an intelligence and determination that set her apart from other girls of her generation. While most daughters of wealthy families were educated only in domestic skills like embroidery, music, and household management, Wu Zhao somehow gained access to a much broader education. Historical records suggest her father, perhaps recognizing her exceptional abilities, allowed her to study alongside her brothers. She learned to read and write classical Chinese, studied history and philosophy, and even received training in mathematics and basic military strategy. This education was revolutionary for a girl of her time. Most women, even aristocratic ones, were functionally illiterate. The ability to read and write was considered a masculine pursuit that might make a woman too independent and therefore unmarriageable. But Wu Zhao absorbed knowledge like a sponge, developing not just literacy but genuine intellectual sophistication that would later allow her to debate with court scholars and compose her own imperial edicts. Her physical appearance was equally remarkable, though descriptions from the period must be viewed through the lens of later political propaganda. Contemporary accounts describe her as extraordinarily beautiful, with perfect skin, elegant features, and a commanding presence that made her stand out in any crowd. But more importantly, she possessed what Chinese historians called dragon phoenix charisma, an almost supernatural ability to command attention and inspire both loyalty and fear in those around her. Wu Zhao's childhood was cut short in 636, when her father died unexpectedly. She was just 12 years old, and his death dramatically altered her family's circumstances. Under Chinese inheritance laws, the family business and properties passed to Wu Shihuo's eldest son from his first wife. Wu Zhao, her mother, and her younger siblings found themselves dependent on the generosity of their half-brothers, who showed little inclination to support them generously. This experience of sudden powerlessness and financial insecurity would profoundly shape Wu Zhao's worldview. She learned firsthand how quickly fortune could change and how vulnerable women were in a system that offered them no independent legal or economic rights. Rather than accept her reduced circumstances, she began planning her escape from a life of genteel poverty and dependence. The opportunity came in 638 when Emperor Taizong issued a call for beautiful young women to join his imperial harem. This was a regular practice in Chinese courts, where the emperor maintained hundreds of concubines ranked in elaborate hierarchies. For most families, having a daughter selected as an imperial concubine was considered a great honor that might elevate the entire family's status. For Wu Zhao, it represented something even more valuable, a chance to escape the limitations of her birth and enter the center of political power. At 14 years old, Wu Zhao was selected from thousands of candidates to become a fifth-rank concubine, given the title Kairen, which meant talented person. This was not a particularly high rank in the complex hierarchy of imperial women, but it was enough to get her inside the Forbidden City and into proximity with the most powerful man in China. The imperial harem was a world unto itself, a complex ecosystem of competition, alliance, and intrigue that made the outside political world look simple by comparison. Hundreds of women lived in luxurious apartments, attended by armies of servants, but most would never even meet the emperor, much less bear his children or influence his decisions. The vast majority would live out their lives in gilded captivity, forgotten and irrelevant. Emperor Taizong, born Li Shimin, was one of the greatest rulers in Chinese history. He had helped his father establish the Tang dynasty and had personally led military campaigns that expanded Chinese territory to its greatest extent. He was intelligent, cultured, and genuinely committed to good governance. But he was also a middle-aged man with dozens of wives and concubines, unlikely to pay much attention to one teenage girl among so many. Wu Zhao understood this challenge from the moment she entered the palace. Unlike other concubines who relied solely on their beauty or tried to attract the emperor's attention through traditional feminine accomplishments, she took a completely different approach. She made herself useful. Drawing on her unusual education, Wu Zhao began offering to help with administrative tasks that other concubines considered beneath them. She could read and write better than many court officials, and she had an intuitive understanding of bureaucratic processes. When the emperor needed documents copied or letters translated, Wu Zhao volunteered. When he wanted someone to read to him from historical texts, she was available with perfect pronunciation and insightful commentary. More importantly, she began to study the emperor himself with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. She learned his preferences, his moods, his political concerns, and his personal insecurities. While other concubines tried to entertain him, Wu Zhao made herself indispensable by becoming his intellectual companion and trusted advisor. This strategy required incredible patience and self-control. Wu Zhao spent months, then years, slowly building her relationship with the emperor while carefully observing the complex web of palace politics around her. She identified the key players, understood the factional divisions among court officials, and began to cultivate her own network of allies among servants, eunuchs, and minor officials who had access to valuable information. The imperial court was divided into numerous competing factions, based on regional origins, philosophical differences, and personal loyalties. The most powerful group consisted of the founding families who had helped establish the Tang dynasty and felt entitled to permanent influence. These aristocratic clans looked down on newcomers like Wu Zhao and actively worked to limit the emperor's ability to promote people from outside their circle. Wu Zhao quickly realized that her merchant family background, which had seemed like a disadvantage, was actually a strength in this environment. She had no existing factional loyalties, which meant she could navigate between different groups without being automatically categorized as an enemy. She also understood commerce and economics in ways that the aristocratic officials, who considered trade beneath their dignity, did not. As months turned to years, Wu Zhao's influence with Emperor Taizong grew steadily. She graduated from copying documents to drafting them, from reading historical texts to discussing their political implications, from listening to court debates to offering her own opinions. The emperor, who had initially seen her as just another pretty face in his harem, began to recognize her exceptional intelligence and rely on her judgment. But Wu Zhao's ambitions extended far beyond becoming the emperor's favorite concubine. She understood that her position, while privileged, was fundamentally insecure. Imperial favor could disappear overnight, and concubines who fell from grace often found themselves exiled to remote temples or worse. She needed to build a more permanent foundation for power, and that meant expanding her influence beyond her personal relationship with the emperor. She began cultivating relationships with the emperor's children, particularly his heir apparent, Prince Li Chengqian. This was dangerous territory, as court protocols strictly limited contact between concubines and imperial princes. But Wu Zhao was careful to position her interactions as educational and administrative rather than personal. She offered to help with the prince's correspondence, provided insights into court politics, and gradually made herself useful to the future emperor, as well as the current one. Unfortunately, Wu Zhao's careful cultivation of Prince Li Chengqian would prove to be a miscalculation that nearly ended her political career before it truly began. The prince, despite being the designated heir, was struggling with personal demons that made him increasingly unstable and unreliable as a political ally. Li Chengqian had grown up under enormous pressure as the crown prince of the world's most powerful empire. Every aspect of his life was scrutinized by court officials. His education was rigidly controlled by Confucian tutors, and his future role as emperor weighed heavily on his young shoulders. Rather than rising to meet these expectations, the prince began to rebel in increasingly dangerous ways. He developed a fascination with Turkish culture, adopting their clothing, customs, and even their military tactics. This was seen as deeply inappropriate for a future Chinese emperor, especially since the Tang dynasty was actively fighting Turkish tribes on the northern frontier. Even more troubling, Li Chengqian began to surround himself with disreputable companions and engage in behavior that court observers considered beneath imperial dignity. Wu Zhao watched these developments with growing concern. Her political instincts told her that the prince's erratic behavior was making him vulnerable to his enemies at court, and by extension, making her vulnerable as well. She had invested significant time and energy in building a relationship with him, but now that investment was becoming a liability, the situation came to a head in 623 when Prince Li Chengqian was implicated in a conspiracy to assassinate his father and seize the throne prematurely. The plot was discovered before it could be executed, but the mere fact that the crown prince had participated in such a scheme sent shockwaves through the imperial court. Emperor Taizong was devastated by his son's betrayal and immediately began investigating everyone who had been associated with the prince. Wu Zhao found herself in an incredibly precarious position. Her connections to Li Chengqian were well documented, and many court officials viewed her as a potential conspirator who might have influenced the prince's rebellious behavior. The investigation that followed was thorough and ruthless, with dozens of people interrogated, tortured, and executed for their alleged roles in the conspiracy. But Wu Zhao's years of careful observation and relationship building now paid unexpected dividends. She had maintained connections with officials from multiple factions, and several of them spoke on her behalf during the investigation. More importantly, her genuine usefulness to the emperor as an administrative assistant and intellectual companion had created a reservoir of goodwill that protected her from the worst suspicions. Emperor Taizong ultimately concluded that Wu Zhao had been naive rather than treacherous in her relationship with the disgraced prince. She had been used by Li Chengqian rather than using him, a victim of his manipulation rather than a co-conspirator in his rebellion. This interpretation allowed the emperor to maintain his relationship with Wu Zhao while distancing himself from the painful memory of his son's betrayal. The prince conspiracy crisis taught Wu Zhao several crucial lessons about palace politics that would guide her future actions. First, she learned that backing the wrong person, even for rational reasons, could be catastrophic. Political calculations that seemed logical could be overturned overnight by unexpected events or personality flaws. Second, she discovered the immense value of maintaining relationships across factional lines. Her survival had depended not on the loyalty of any single group, but on having allies in multiple camps who could vouch for her character and usefulness. Most importantly, Wu Zhao realized that her ultimate security lay not in attaching herself to any individual, no matter how powerful, but in making herself independently valuable to the imperial system itself. She needed to become so useful, so knowledgeable, and so connected that removing her would be more costly than protecting her. With Prince Li Chengqian disgraced and eventually exiled, Emperor Taizong designated his ninth son, Li Ji, as the new crown prince. Li Ji was everything his predecessor had not been: studious, respectful of tradition, and genuinely committed to preparing himself for imperial responsibilities. But he was also young, inexperienced, and somewhat overwhelmed by the enormous expectations now placed upon him. Wu Zhao recognized an opportunity in the new crown prince's situation. Unlike her relationship with Li Chengqian, which had been based on personal charm and administrative assistance, her approach to Li Ji would be more strategic and carefully planned. She would position herself not as a friend or companion, but as an essential resource for his future success as emperor. She began by studying Li Ji's personality, interests, and weaknesses with the same methodical approach she had applied to understanding his father. The young prince was intelligent, but lacked confidence in his own judgment. He was well educated in classical texts, but had little practical experience with the complexities of governing a vast empire. Most critically, he was surrounded by advisors who were either too deferential to offer honest counsel or too focused on their own agendas to prioritize his interests. Wu Zhao slowly inserted herself into this advisory ecosystem, not as a replacement for existing counselors, but as a unique resource who could provide perspectives unavailable elsewhere. She offered insights into court gossip and factional dynamics that the prince's official tutors, bound by protocol and propriety, could not discuss. She provided honest assessments of policy proposals that his sycophantic attendants would never dare to criticize. More subtly, she began to position herself as Li Ji's window into the real world, beyond the artificial environment of the palace. As a former merchant's daughter who had experienced poverty and uncertainty, she could explain the practical implications of imperial policies in ways that aristocratic advisors, insulated by generations of wealth and privilege, simply could not. This strategy required Wu Zhao to walk an incredibly fine line. She needed to be useful enough to the crown prince to secure his protection and patronage, but not so involved in his affairs that she would be seen as manipulating him for her own benefit. She had to demonstrate loyalty and wisdom while maintaining the appearance of proper deference and humility. The balancing act became even more complex as Emperor Taizong's health began to decline in the late 640s. The emperor, now in his 50s and exhausted by decades of military campaigns and administrative responsibilities, was showing signs of age and illness that made the question of imperial succession increasingly urgent. Court officials began positioning themselves for the transition to a new reign, and the competition for influence with the future emperor intensified dramatically. Wu Zhao found herself caught between two different power structures: the existing imperial court centered around Emperor Taizong, where she had spent years building her position, and the emerging court of Crown Prince Li Zhi, where she was working to establish new relationships and influence. Managing both relationships simultaneously required extraordinary diplomatic skill and political intelligence. She had to maintain her usefulness to the current emperor while building credibility with his successor, all while avoiding the appearance of disloyalty or opportunism that could destroy her standing with either man. This challenge was complicated by the fact that father and son, despite their mutual respect and affection, had different personalities, priorities, and governing philosophies that sometimes put them at odds with each other. Emperor Taizong was a warrior scholar who had personally led armies and conquered territories. He valued direct action, personal courage, and decisive leadership. His approach to governance was hands-on and pragmatic, shaped by his experience as a military commander who had learned to make quick decisions based on incomplete information. Crown Prince Li Zhi, by contrast, was more contemplative and cautious. He preferred to study problems thoroughly before acting, to consult multiple advisors before making decisions, and to consider the long-term implications of policies rather than focusing on immediate results. His governing style was more collaborative and systematic than his father's, but also potentially slower and more indecisive. Wu Zhao adapted her approach to each man's personality and preferences. With Emperor Taizong, she emphasized practical solutions and immediate benefits. She presented information concisely, offered clear recommendations, and demonstrated how her suggestions aligned with his existing priorities and policies. Her communications with him were direct, confident, and focused on results. With Crown Prince Li Zhi, she took a more nuanced approach. She presented multiple perspectives on complex issues, acknowledged uncertainties and potential complications, and emphasized the importance of building consensus among different factions before implementing major changes. Her interactions with him were more deferential and collaborative, positioning herself as a resource to support his decision-making process rather than as an advocate for specific outcomes. This dual strategy worked brilliantly for several years, allowing Wu Zhao to strengthen her position with both the current and future emperor, while avoiding the factional conflicts that destroyed many other court figures during succession periods. But it also created new vulnerabilities that would soon test her political skills to their limits. As Emperor Taizong's health continued to deteriorate, rumors began circulating about an improper relationship between Wu Zhao and Crown Prince Li Zhi. These rumors were probably inevitable given the amount of time they spent together and the obvious intelligence and ambition that Wu Zhao displayed. In a court culture that viewed women primarily as sexual objects rather than political actors, any significant interaction between an attractive concubine and a young prince would be interpreted through a romantic lens. The rumors were particularly dangerous because they violated fundamental protocols governing imperial succession. Concubines belonged to the emperor and were expected to remain loyal to him alone. Any suggestion that a concubine was cultivating relationships with potential successors could be interpreted as treason, adultery, or both. Even if the relationship was purely political and administrative, the appearance of impropriety could be enough to destroy everyone involved. Wu Zhou realized that her carefully constructed position was becoming untenable. She could not continue building influence with Li Zhi without risking accusations that could lead to her execution. But she also could not abandon her investment in the future emperor without sacrificing the security and power she had worked so hard to achieve. The solution she devised was characteristically bold and risky. Rather than trying to hide or minimize her relationship with the crown prince, Wu Zhao decided to reframe it entirely. She would transform what appeared to be a liability into a strategic advantage by changing the fundamental terms of the discussion. In early 649, as Emperor Taizong lay dying, Wu Zhao made a decision that would alter the course of Chinese history. Instead of waiting passively for events to unfold around her, she chose to take control of her own destiny in a way that no woman in Chinese history had ever attempted. But that remarkable gamble, and its even more extraordinary consequences, would have to wait for the emperor's death and the beginning of an entirely new phase in Wu Zhao's relentless pursuit of ultimate power. The death of Emperor Taizong in 649 CE marked the end of an era and the beginning of Wu Zhao's most dangerous gamble yet. According to ancient Chinese tradition, when an emperor died, his concubines faced one of two fates. They could be buried alive with their master to serve him in the afterlife, or they could have their heads shaved and spend the remainder of their lives as Buddhist nuns in remote monasteries. Neither option offered any possibility of maintaining political influence or personal freedom. For most concubines, this transition represented the inevitable end of whatever brief moment of luxury and relevance they had experienced. They would disappear into obscurity, forgotten by history and irrelevant to the future of the empire. But Wu Zhao had spent over a decade preparing for exactly this moment, and she had no intention of accepting either traditional fate. The funeral of Emperor Taizong was a spectacular display of imperial grandeur that lasted for months. His body lay in state in the magnificent Daming Palace, while officials from across the empire traveled to Chang'an to pay their respects. Buddhist monks chanted prayers for his soul. Confucian scholars composed elaborate eulogies celebrating his achievements, and Taoist priests performed rituals to ensure his peaceful transition to the afterlife. Wu Zhao participated in these ceremonies with perfect propriety, displaying the grief and devotion expected from an imperial concubine. She wore the white robes of mourning, wept at the appropriate moments, and followed all the complex protocols that governed behavior during the extended funeral period. To outside observers, she appeared to be just another grieving woman preparing to accept her fate as a discarded relic of the previous reign. But beneath this facade of traditional feminine submission, Wu Zhao was executing the most audacious political maneuver in Chinese history. During the chaotic weeks between the emperor's death and his successor's formal coronation, she was secretly communicating with Crown Prince Li Ji, now preparing to become Emperor Gaozong. These communications were extraordinarily dangerous, as any contact between a dead emperor's concubine and his successor could be interpreted as evidence of an adulterous relationship that had begun while Taizong was still alive. The content of these messages has been lost to history, but their effect was unmistakable. Instead of allowing Wu Zhao to disappear into a monastery, as tradition demanded, the new Emperor Gaozong intervened to change her fate. Using his authority as the new ruler, he declared that Wu Zhao's administrative skills and intellectual abilities were too valuable to waste on religious contemplation. He announced that she would be recalled to the imperial court to serve in his government. This decision shocked the entire imperial establishment. Never before had a Chinese emperor recalled his father's concubine to active service. The precedent was not just unusual, it was unthinkable. Court officials were horrified by what they saw as a violation of fundamental moral principles that governed imperial behavior. Buddhist monks were scandalized by the emperor's apparent disregard for proper religious observances. Even common people throughout the empire gossiped about the young emperor's strange decision to surround himself with his father's former women. But Emperor Gaozong was not acting impulsively or irrationally. He was a thoughtful, methodical ruler who had spent years observing Wu Zhao's capabilities and understanding her potential value to his administration. Unlike his father, who had been an experienced military commander and seasoned politician when he took power, Gaozong was ascending to the throne as a young man with limited practical experience in governance. The Tang Empire in 649 was facing numerous challenges that required immediate attention. Turkish tribes were launching raids along the northern frontier. Korean kingdoms were resisting Chinese influence on the peninsula, and internal rebellions were flaring up in several provinces. The imperial bureaucracy was dominated by powerful aristocratic families who had their own agendas and were not necessarily loyal to the new emperor. Managing these complex problems required advisors who were both competent and completely dependent on imperial favor for their position and security. Wu Zhao fit this description perfectly. Her intelligence and administrative skills had been proven over years of service to Emperor Taizong. Her merchant family background meant she had no independent power base that might compete with imperial authority. Most importantly, her controversial return to court made her completely dependent on Emperor Gaozong's protection. She could not survive politically without his support, which meant her loyalty was guaranteed in ways that traditional aristocratic advisors could never match. The emperor's decision to recall Wu Zhao was therefore both personally motivated and politically shrewd. He was bringing back a woman he trusted and found intellectually stimulating, but he was also acquiring a uniquely valuable political asset who could help him navigate the treacherous early years of his reign. Wu Zhao returned to the imperial court in 650, not as a concubine, but as something entirely new in Chinese history. A female government official with real administrative responsibilities and political influence. Her formal title was modest, but her actual role was far more significant. She had direct access to the emperor, participated in policy discussions, and gradually began to influence major decisions about both domestic governance and foreign policy. Her first major challenge was establishing credibility with the existing court bureaucracy, most of whom viewed her appointment as a dangerous precedent that violated traditional gender roles and governmental procedures. These officials had spent their entire careers climbing through established hierarchies based on literary examinations, family connections, and factional loyalties. The sudden appearance of a woman with direct imperial access and apparent policy influence threatened their understanding of how government was supposed to work. Wu Zhao addressed this resistance with characteristic intelligence and patience. Rather than trying to directly confront or override the existing bureaucratic establishment, she found ways to work within and around existing systems. She focused initially on areas where her unique background and skills provided clear advantages that even skeptical officials had to acknowledge. Her experience as a merchant's daughter, for example, gave her insights into trade and economic policy that aristocratic officials lacked. When debates arose about tax collection, commercial regulations, or infrastructure projects, Wu Zhao could provide practical perspectives based on real-world experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Her recommendations were often more effective than those offered by officials whose understanding of economics came entirely from classical texts. She also leveraged her years of observation and relationship building within the imperial court to become an invaluable source of information about factional dynamics and personal rivalries among government officials. Emperor Gaozong, like any ruler, needed to understand the complex web of alliances and conflicts within his administration in order to make effective personnel decisions and prevent conspiracies. Wu Zhao's comprehensive knowledge of court politics made her an essential intelligence resource. More subtly, she began to position herself as a bridge between the emperor and various constituencies that traditional advisors found difficult to understand or communicate with effectively. Her humble origins allowed her to speak credibly about the concerns of merchants, farmers, and artisans in ways that aristocratic officials could not. Her gender gave her access to information about the imperial harem and the concerns of court women that male advisors never heard. This multifaceted approach gradually established Wu Zhao as an indispensable member of Emperor Gaozong's inner circle. Officials who had initially opposed her appointment began to recognize her value and seek her support for their own initiatives. Factional leaders who had viewed her as an outsider started treating her as a potential ally whose influence with the emperor could advance their interests. But Wu Zhao's growing political influence created new dangers that she had to navigate carefully. The more important she became to the emperor's government, the more threatening she appeared to established power centers that had reasons to limit her authority. The most dangerous opposition came from the empress and the imperial in-laws who had expected to dominate the new reign. Empress Wang had married Li Ju several years before his accession to the throne, and she had reasonable expectations that becoming emperor would elevate her to a position of significant influence within the court. As the official wife of the ruler, she should have been the most important woman in the empire, with authority over the imperial household and informal influence over policy decisions affecting women and family matters. Instead, Empress Wang found herself increasingly marginalized by Wu Zhao's growing influence with her husband. The emperor spent more time consulting with Wu Zhao about government business than he did discussing personal matters with his official wife. Court observers began to notice that Wu Zhao's recommendations carried more weight in imperial decision-making than the empress's opinions. This situation was not just personally humiliating for Empress Wang, it was politically dangerous for her entire extended family. The Wang clan had invested heavily in her marriage to the future emperor, expecting that her position as empress would provide them with preferential access to government positions, lucrative contracts, and policy influence. If Wu Zhao continued to gain power at the empress's expense, the Wang family's political investments would lose value and their rivals would gain advantages. Empress Wang's response to this challenge revealed both her limitations as a political strategist and the fundamental differences between her approach to power and Wu Zhao's methods. Rather than trying to compete with Wu Zhao on intellectual or administrative grounds, the empress focused on emphasizing traditional gender roles and moral propriety. She positioned herself as the defender of conventional values against Wu Zhao's dangerous innovations. This strategy had some initial success among conservative court officials who were already uncomfortable with Wu Zhao's unprecedented role in government. Empress Wang argued that allowing a former concubine to participate in policy discussions violated fundamental principles of imperial dignity and Confucian morality. She suggested that the emperor's reliance on Wu Zhao's advice was inappropriate and potentially corrupting to the moral foundation of imperial rule. But Empress Wang's approach suffered from a critical weakness. It offered no practical alternative to Wu Zhao's contributions. The empress could criticize Wu Zhao's influence, but she could not replace Wu Zhao's administrative skills, political intelligence, or economic insights. Her arguments were based on abstract principles rather than concrete benefits, which made them less compelling to an emperor who was struggling with real governmental challenges. Wu Zhao recognized the threat that Empress Wang represented, but she also understood that direct confrontation would be counterproductive. Any open conflict between the emperor's wife and his advisor would force Emperor Gaozong to choose sides, and traditional protocol strongly favored the empress in such disputes. Wu Zhao needed a more subtle approach that would undermine her rival without creating an obvious crisis. Her solution was to make herself even more indispensable, while simultaneously demonstrating the limitations of traditional approaches to imperial administration. When policy debates arose, Wu Zhao consistently offered more practical and effective solutions than other advisors, including implicit alternatives to suggestions from the empress's faction. When administrative problems emerged, she provided faster and more comprehensive responses than established bureaucratic channels. More importantly, Wu Zhao began to document and publicize her contributions to successful government initiatives. When her recommendations led to increased tax revenues, she made sure the emperor understood her role in achieving those results. When her insights helped resolve diplomatic conflicts or prevent internal rebellions, she ensured that her contributions were recorded in official documents and remembered by key officials. This systematic approach to building and demonstrating her value created a powerful argument for maintaining and expanding her influence that was based on measurable results rather than theoretical principles. Even officials who were philosophically opposed to female participation in government found it difficult to argue against Wu Zhao's track record of successful policy contributions. The competition between Wu Zhao and Empress Wang intensified throughout the early 650s as both women worked to consolidate their influence with the emperor and build supporting coalitions among court officials. This rivalry was complicated by the birth of children to both women, which added succession politics to the already complex dynamics of imperial court competition. Empress Wang gave birth to a daughter in 651, which was disappointing since male heirs were essential for securing dynastic succession. Wu Zhao, meanwhile, had given birth to a son in 652, followed by another son in 653. These births dramatically altered the balance of power between the two women, as Wu Zhao's sons represented potential heirs to the imperial throne, while the empress's daughter did not. The existence of male heirs born to Wu Zhao created new political possibilities that neither woman had previously considered. If something happened to Emperor Gaozong, or if he chose to designate one of Wu Zhao's sons as his successor, she could potentially become the mother of a future emperor. This prospect offered a path to long-term political security and influence that went far beyond her current role as an imperial advisor. But the birth of these children also created new vulnerabilities and dangers. Court protocol regarding imperial succession was complex and politically sensitive, with established procedures for determining which sons should be considered legitimate heirs and which women should be recognized as imperial mothers. Wu Zhao's irregular status as a recalled concubine rather than an official wife complicated these calculations and provided her enemies with new arguments against her growing influence. The situation became even more complex in 654, when tragedy struck the imperial family in a way that would forever change the trajectory of Wu Zhao's career and Chinese history itself. The specific details of what happened remain controversial among historians, but the consequences were undeniable. Empress Wang's infant daughter died under mysterious circumstances, and Wu Zhao was accused of murdering the child to eliminate a potential rival. The accusation was devastating and potentially fatal. If Wu Zhao was found guilty of murdering an imperial child, she would face immediate execution along with all her relatives and associates. The charge was particularly dangerous because it combined several of the most serious crimes possible in imperial China: treason against the royal family, violation of fundamental moral principles governing the protection of children, and abuse of trusted access to the imperial household. But the accusation also revealed the desperation of Wu Zhao's enemies and their inability to challenge her influence through conventional political means. The timing and circumstances of the charges suggested that they were motivated more by factional rivalry than by genuine evidence of criminal behavior. This created an opportunity for Wu Zhao to turn the crisis to her advantage if she could manage the political implications skillfully. Her response to the murder accusation would demonstrate both her political genius and her willingness to use the most ruthless methods necessary to protect and advance her position. The strategies she employed during this crisis would establish patterns of behavior that would characterize her entire subsequent career as she climbed toward ultimate power in the Chinese Empire. But the specific tactics Wu Zhao used to survive and triumph over this potentially deadly challenge, and the long-term consequences of her choices for both her own future and the stability of the Tang dynasty, would prove to be even more extraordinary than anything she had accomplished so far. The murder accusation against Wu Zhao represented the most dangerous moment of her political career, but it also revealed the fundamental weakness of her enemy's position. The charges were based more on court gossip and factional animosity than on actual evidence, which gave Wu Zhao room to maneuver if she could control the narrative and turn public opinion in her favor. Her first move was characteristically bold and unexpected. Instead of retreating into defensive denials or seeking protection through traditional channels, Wu Zhao chose to go on the offensive against her accusers. She began by systematically documenting the timeline of events surrounding the infant's death, gathering testimony from servants, physicians, and other witnesses who had been present in the imperial household during the relevant period. This investigation revealed several inconvenient facts that undermined the murder theory. The child had been ill for several days before dying, showing symptoms consistent with common childhood diseases that claimed many imperial infants despite the best medical care available. Multiple physicians had examined the baby and prescribed treatments that proved ineffective. Most importantly, Wu Zhao had been in the company of other court officials during most of the period when the alleged crime supposedly occurred, making it practically impossible for her to have administered poison or committed other acts of violence. But Wu Zhao understood that facts alone would not be sufficient to protect her from politically motivated accusations. She needed to shift the entire framework of the debate from questions about her guilt or innocence to larger issues about the stability and effectiveness of imperial government. Her survival depended on making herself appear more valuable to the emperor and the empire than her enemies. She accomplished this transformation by positioning the accusations against her as part of a broader conspiracy by conservative factions to undermine Emperor Gaozong's authority and reverse the administrative reforms that had made his government more effective than his predecessors. Wu Zhao argued that her enemies were using the tragedy of an infant's death as a pretext to attack innovative approaches to governance that threatened their traditional privileges and power. This reframing was politically brilliant because it transformed Wu Zhao from a defendant in a criminal case into a symbol of progressive government reform. Officials who supported modernizing the imperial bureaucracy found themselves defending Wu Zhao not because they necessarily liked her personally, but because attacking her meant attacking the broader reform agenda they favored. Conversely, officials who opposed her found themselves associated with reactionary resistance to beneficial changes in government operations. Emperor Gaozong, who had invested significant political capital in Wu Zhao's appointment and had personally benefited from her administrative contributions, recognized the implications of the accusations immediately. If Wu Zhao was removed from government under these circumstances, it would signal that traditional factions could veto his personnel decisions and policy initiatives by manufacturing scandals and moral controversies. His authority as emperor would be permanently undermined if he allowed politically motivated accusations to determine who could serve in his administration. The emperor's response demonstrated both his political sophistication and his genuine commitment to protecting Wu Zhao from her enemies. Rather than conducting a private investigation that might be influenced by factional pressures, he announced that the accusations would be examined through formal legal procedures that would be open to observation by court officials and foreign diplomats. This transparency made it much more difficult for Wu Zhao's enemies to manipulate evidence or testimony. More importantly, Emperor Gaozong used the investigation as an opportunity to review and strengthen Wu Zhao's official position within the government hierarchy. He announced that regardless of the outcome of the criminal charges, Wu Zhao's administrative contributions had been so valuable that her role would be expanded and formalized through new titles and responsibilities that would make her status less vulnerable to future political attacks. This announcement sent a clear message to court factions about the emperor's priorities and expectations. Officials who wanted to maintain imperial favor would need to work with Wu Zhao rather than against her. Those who continued to oppose her would find themselves increasingly isolated from the centers of power and decision-making. The formal investigation into the murder accusations proceeded slowly and carefully over several months, with testimony from dozens of witnesses and examination of physical evidence by multiple experts. The process was designed to be thorough enough to satisfy skeptics, while also demonstrating the weakness of the case against Wu Zhao. During this period, Wu Zhao continued to perform her administrative duties with characteristic competence and efficiency. She participated in policy meetings, drafted government documents, and provided advice on diplomatic and military matters, as if the accusations against her were merely a temporary distraction. This behavior reinforced her image as a dedicated public servant whose primary concern was effective governance rather than personal survival. The investigation's final report, issued in early 655, officially exonerated Wu Zhao of any criminal wrongdoing in the infant's death. The report concluded that the child had died of natural causes, possibly complicated by inadequate medical knowledge about treating childhood illnesses. More significantly, the report criticized officials who had promoted the murder accusations as having acted irresponsibly and potentially harmfully to imperial interests. But Wu Zhao's vindication came with costs that would shape her future political strategies. The months of controversy had revealed the depth of opposition to her influence among traditional court factions and the lengths to which her enemies would go to remove her from power. She understood that surviving this particular attack did not guarantee protection from future conspiracies, and that her position remained fundamentally vulnerable as long as she lacked formal authority that could not be easily challenged. Her solution to this problem would prove to be even more audacious than her previous political maneuvers. Instead of simply trying to strengthen her existing position as an imperial advisor, Wu Zhao began planning to fundamentally transform her status within the imperial hierarchy in ways that would make future attacks against her much more difficult and dangerous for her enemies. The key to this transformation lay in her relationship with Emperor Gaozong and her growing influence over imperial succession politics. Wu Zhao had already demonstrated her value as an administrator and policy advisor, but these roles, however important, were still technically subordinate positions that could be eliminated if political circumstances changed. She needed to acquire a form of power that was more permanent and legally protected. The solution she devised involved leveraging her position as the mother of potential imperial heirs to claim formal recognition as an imperial wife, rather than merely a recalled concubine. This change in status would not only provide her with greater legal protections and ceremonial authority, but would also position her sons as legitimate candidates for imperial succession, giving her a long-term stake in the dynasty's future. But achieving this transformation required Wu Zhao to overcome centuries of precedent and protocol that governed imperial marriages and succession procedures. No emperor in Chinese history had ever elevated a former concubine of his father to the status of empress, and the practical and symbolic implications of such an unprecedented action would create enormous resistance among traditional court factions. Wu Zhao began preparing for this campaign by systematically building support among key constituencies whose backing would be essential for success. She cultivated relationships with military commanders who valued her insights into strategic planning and resource allocation. She developed alliances with provincial governors who appreciated her understanding of local economic conditions and administrative challenges. Most importantly, she strengthened her connections with younger court officials who were more open to innovative approaches to governance and less committed to traditional restrictions on female participation in politics. This coalition-building effort required Wu Zhao to demonstrate her value to each group in terms they found compelling and relevant to their specific interests and concerns. Military officers needed to see evidence that her influence led to better funding and strategic planning for their campaigns. Provincial administrators wanted proof that her policy recommendations improved tax collection and local stability. Court officials required assurance that supporting her would advance their own career prospects and political objectives. Wu Zhao provided these demonstrations through a series of successful policy initiatives that showcased her administrative capabilities while building political debts among key constituencies. She developed new systems for military supply and logistics that improved the effectiveness of frontier campaigns against Turkish and Korean forces. She created innovative approaches to tax collection and agricultural development that increased imperial revenues while reducing the burden on local populations. She established new procedures for personnel evaluation and promotion that made government service more attractive to talented individuals from diverse backgrounds. Each of these accomplishments served multiple purposes in Wu Zhao's broader political strategy. They provided concrete evidence of her value to imperial administration, making it harder for opponents to argue that her influence was purely personal rather than professional. They created networks of officials and military officers who had direct interests in maintaining and expanding her authority. Most importantly, they demonstrated that Wu Zhao's approach to governance produced better results than traditional methods, giving Emperor Gaozong practical reasons to support her elevation beyond personal affection or loyalty. By late 655, Wu Zhao felt confident enough in her political position to begin the final phase of her campaign for formal recognition as Empress. This would require her to directly challenge Empress Wang and the powerful family networks that supported the existing imperial marriage, making it the most dangerous gamble of her career. Success would provide her with unprecedented power and security, but failure would likely result in exile or execution for herself and her children. The opening move in this campaign came through an unexpected channel that revealed Wu Zhao's sophisticated understanding of imperial psychology and court politics. Rather than directly asking Emperor Gaozong to divorce his current wife, she began subtly questioning whether the existing imperial marriage was providing adequate support for the emperor's governing responsibilities and personal welfare. Wu Zhao's approach was indirect but systematic. During policy discussions, she would occasionally mention how much more effective the emperor could be if he had a partner who truly understood the complexities of imperial administration. In private conversations, she would express concern about the emperor's health and stress levels, suggesting that he needed someone who could provide both intellectual companionship and emotional support during the challenging periods of his reign. These conversations were carefully designed to plant seeds of dissatisfaction with the emperor's current domestic arrangements, without appearing to promote her own interests directly. Wu Zhao wanted Emperor Gaozong to reach his own conclusions about the inadequacy of his marriage to Empress Wang, making any subsequent changes appear to be his initiative rather than her manipulation. The strategy worked exactly as intended. Emperor Gaozong began to compare his interactions with Wu Zhao, which were intellectually stimulating and politically productive, with his relationship with Empress Wang, which was formal, ceremonial, and largely irrelevant to his work as emperor. The contrast became increasingly obvious and frustrating to him as he realized how much more satisfaction and support he received from Wu Zhao than from his official wife. This growing dissatisfaction was encouraged by Wu Zhao's continued demonstrations of her administrative competence and political insight. During the winter of 655, a series of crises tested the imperial government's ability to respond effectively to unexpected challenges. Severe flooding in several southern provinces disrupted agricultural production and created refugee populations that needed emergency assistance. Diplomatic tensions with Korean kingdoms escalated into military conflicts that required rapid deployment of troops and supplies. Internal rebellions in Western territories threatened to spread, if not suppressed, quickly and decisively. Wu Zhao's responses to these crises were faster, more comprehensive, and more effective than those provided by traditional government channels. Her recommendations for flood relief were based on practical understanding of agricultural economics rather than theoretical knowledge from classical texts. Her strategic assessments of military situations reflected genuine comprehension of logistics and supply chain management, rather than abstract principles of warfare. Her proposals for dealing with internal rebellions demonstrated sophisticated analysis of regional politics and ethnic relations, rather than simple applications of traditional punishment methods. Emperor Gaozong could not help but notice that Wu Zhao consistently provided better advice and more useful insights than his other advisors, including those who were supposed to be experts in their respective fields. This comparison made him increasingly frustrated with the limitations of his existing advisory system and more appreciative of Wu Zhao's unique contributions to effective governance. The contrast was particularly striking when he compared Wu Zhao's capabilities with those of Empress Wang, who had no meaningful role in addressing any of the governmental challenges facing the empire. The Empress was expected to focus on ceremonial duties and household management, activities that seemed trivial and irrelevant compared to the life and death decisions required for imperial administration. Emperor Gaozong began to question whether his domestic arrangements were appropriate for someone who needed maximum support and assistance in governing the world's largest and most complex empire. Wu Zhi carefully monitored the emperor's evolving attitudes and began to prepare for the decisive conversation that would determine her future. She understood that she would have only one opportunity to propose her elevation to Empress, and that the timing, presentation, and justification for her request would be absolutely critical to its success. Everything she had accomplished over the previous decade had been preparation for this single moment of maximum risk and maximum opportunity. The conversation finally took place in early 656, during a private meeting where Wu Zhao and Emperor Gaozong were reviewing reports from provincial governors about the effectiveness of recent policy reforms. The discussion naturally led to broader questions about governmental efficiency and the emperor's need for comprehensive support in managing imperial responsibilities. Wu Zhao began by acknowledging the enormous burdens that Emperor Gaozong carried as ruler of the Tang Empire, emphasizing how much more complex and demanding imperial administration had become compared to earlier periods when China was smaller and less developed. She noted that previous emperors had been able to rely on simpler governmental structures and more limited advisory systems, but that contemporary challenges required more sophisticated and comprehensive approaches to decision-making and policy implementation. From this foundation, she gradually moved toward the question of whether the emperor's personal and domestic arrangements were adequate to support his professional responsibilities. Wu Zhou suggested that effective imperial governance required not just competent advisors and administrators, but also intimate companions who could provide intellectual partnership, emotional support, and practical assistance with the constant stream of decisions and problems that defined imperial life. The implicit criticism of Empress Wang was subtle, but unmistakable. Wu Zhao was suggesting that the emperor deserved and needed a wife who could be a true partner in governing the empire, someone who understood administrative complexities and could contribute meaningfully to policy discussions and strategic planning. The current empress, whatever her personal virtues, simply did not possess the knowledge, experience, or capabilities required for such a role. Emperor Gaozong's response revealed that Wu Zhao's months of careful preparation had achieved their intended effect. He acknowledged that he had been thinking along similar lines, recognizing that his governmental responsibilities were not adequately supported by his existing domestic arrangements. He admitted that his most productive and satisfying conversations about imperial business were with Wu Zhao, rather than with his official wife, and that this situation seemed both personally frustrating and professionally inefficient. More significantly, Emperor Gaozong began to explore the practical and political implications of changing his marital status to better align his personal relationships with his governmental needs. He asked Wu Zhao to research the historical precedents and legal procedures that would be required to divorce Empress Wang and elevate someone more suitable to the position of imperial wife. This request represented the breakthrough that Wu Zhao had been working toward for years. The emperor was not simply considering her proposal, he was actively planning to implement it and asking for her assistance in managing the complex process that would be required. Her transformation from concubine to empress was no longer a distant ambition. It was becoming an immediate practical project that would reshape the entire structure of imperial government and Chinese society. But Wu Zhao also understood that the most difficult and dangerous phase of her campaign was just beginning. Convincing Emperor Gaozong to support her elevation was only the first step in a process that would require her to overcome massive resistance from established court factions, traditional religious authorities, and conservative social opinion throughout the empire. The political and cultural obstacles to her unprecedented transformation would test every skill she had developed and every alliance she had built during her remarkable rise to power. The battle to become empress would be fought on multiple fronts simultaneously, requiring Wu Zhao to demonstrate not just her personal capabilities, but also her ability to manage complex political coalitions and navigate treacherous institutional conflicts. Success would make her the most powerful woman in Chinese history, but failure would likely result in the destruction of everything she had worked so hard to achieve. The stakes could not have been higher, and the outcome would determine not just Wu Zhao's personal fate, but the future direction of the Tang dynasty and the role of women in Chinese political life for centuries to come. The campaign to elevate Wu Zhao to empress began in earnest during the spring of 656. and it would prove to be the most complex political undertaking in Tang dynasty history. Wu Zhao understood that this transformation required far more than imperial approval. She needed to systematically dismantle centuries of legal precedent, religious doctrine, and social convention that made her elevation theoretically impossible. Her first challenge was identifying and neutralizing the specific sources of opposition that would inevitably emerge once her intentions became public knowledge. The most dangerous resistance would come from Empress Wang's family, the powerful Wang clan, who had invested their political capital and social prestige in their daughter's position as imperial wife. They would fight desperately to preserve their influence and prevent their rivals from gaining access to the ultimate source of political power. Wu Zhao began by conducting a comprehensive analysis of the Wang family's political network, mapping their alliances, identifying their economic interests, and understanding their strategic vulnerabilities. She discovered that the clan's power rested on several foundations that could potentially be undermined through careful political maneuvering. The Wang family controlled several lucrative government contracts for military supplies and infrastructure projects, relationships that generated enormous wealth but also created dependencies that could be exploited. Their influence in the imperial bureaucracy was concentrated in specific departments and regions where family members held key positions, creating potential choke points that could be targeted through administrative reforms. Most importantly, their political coalition included several ambitious individuals whose loyalty was based on mutual benefit rather than genuine personal commitment, making them potentially vulnerable to better offers from competing factions. Wu Zhao developed a multi-pronged strategy for weakening the Wang clan's ability to oppose her elevation. She began by identifying alternative suppliers for the government contracts they controlled, demonstrating that their services were not irreplaceable and that competition might actually improve quality while reducing costs. She initiated personnel reviews in departments where Wang family influence was strongest, ostensibly to improve administrative efficiency, but actually to create opportunities for replacing their allies with officials more sympathetic to her objectives. More subtly, she began cultivating relationships with younger members of the Wang family who were frustrated by their limited advancement opportunities within the traditional clan hierarchy. These individuals were offered prospects for accelerated promotion and expanded responsibilities in exchange for their neutrality or even support during the coming succession crisis. Wu Zhao understood that dividing her enemies was often more effective than trying to defeat them through direct confrontation. While working to undermine the Wang family's political position, Wu Zhao simultaneously launched a sophisticated propaganda campaign designed to prepare public opinion for her unprecedented elevation. This effort required her to address the fundamental cultural and religious objections that made the concept of a female emperor seem impossible to most Chinese people. The core challenge was that Confucian political philosophy explicitly prohibited women from holding supreme political authority, viewing female rule as a violation of natural order that would inevitably lead to social chaos and dynastic collapse. Buddhist and Taoist religious traditions, while more flexible about gender roles in some contexts, also contained teachings that were generally interpreted as supporting male political dominance. Wu Zhao needed to find ways to reinterpret these philosophical and religious traditions to support, rather than oppose her ambitions. Her approach to this challenge revealed the sophisticated intellectual preparation she had undertaken during her years of study and observation. Wu Zhao began commissioning scholarly research projects that would re-examine classical texts and historical precedents for evidence supporting female political authority. She funded conferences and debates among court intellectuals about the proper interpretation of ancient wisdom regarding governance and leadership. These scholarly initiatives were carefully designed to appear as legitimate academic inquiries rather than politically motivated propaganda exercises. Wu Zhao understood that direct attacks on traditional beliefs would provoke backlash and resistance, but that subtle reinterpretations presented as scholarly discoveries might gradually shift educated opinion in her favor. The research projects she sponsored began uncovering forgotten historical examples of successful female rulers in Chinese history, reinterpreting classical texts that had been traditionally understood as prohibiting female authority, and developing new theological arguments about the relationship between gender and political legitimacy. These findings were disseminated through the imperial court and scholarly networks, creating intellectual foundations for accepting Wu Zhao's elevation as empress. Simultaneously, Wu Zhao worked to build military support for her campaign, recognizing that ultimate political authority in imperial China rested on the ability to command armed force when necessary. Her years of involvement in strategic planning and military logistics had given her extensive contacts among professional officers who valued competence over traditional protocol. She began systematically cultivating relationships with key military commanders, particularly those who had benefited from her administrative reforms and policy recommendations. These officers had seen firsthand how Wu Zhao's insights improved their operational effectiveness, making them more willing to support her political advancement despite potential concerns about gender and precedent. Wu Zhao's approach to building military support was characteristically practical and results-oriented. Rather than asking for abstract loyalty or ideological commitment, she focused on demonstrating continued value to military interests through improved funding, better strategic coordination, and more effective logistical support. Officers who worked with her understood that her elevation would likely mean continued access to her expertise and influence, while her removal might result in less competent administration of military affairs. She also began developing contingency plans for potential violent resistance to her elevation, understanding that some opponents might resort to armed rebellion or assassination attempts rather than accept female rule. These preparations included identifying reliable military units that could be deployed to protect the imperial court, establishing secure communication networks that could coordinate defensive responses, and creating evacuation procedures that could protect her family and key supporters if circumstances required temporary retreat. The military dimension of Wu Zhao's campaign was complicated by the need to maintain operational security while building necessary support networks. Too much preparation might alert her enemies and trigger preemptive attacks, but too little preparation could leave her vulnerable to sudden violent opposition. She had to balance transparency with key allies against secrecy from potential enemies, a delicate calculation that required constant adjustment as political circumstances evolved. During the summer of 656, Wu Zhao's campaign entered its most active phase as Emperor Gaozong began taking concrete steps toward divorcing Empress Wang and formalizing his relationship with his chosen successor. The emperor's decision to move forward created immediate political crises that would test every aspect of Wu Zhao's preparation and strategic planning. The first major confrontation came when senior court officials learned about the emperor's intentions and demanded formal audiences to express their opposition. These officials argued that divorcing Empress Wang would violate fundamental principles of imperial dignity and Confucian morality, potentially destabilizing the dynasty and undermining the emperor's legitimacy both domestically and internationally. The meetings between Emperor Gaozong and his senior advisors were tense and occasionally hostile, with some officials threatening to resign their positions rather than serve under an empress they considered illegitimate. The emperor found himself caught between his personal desires and political calculations on one side, and enormous institutional pressure from the established governmental hierarchy on the other. Wu Zhao played a crucial role in helping Emperor Gaozong navigate these confrontations, providing him with detailed briefings about each official's background, motivations, and potential vulnerabilities. She helped him identify which opposition was based on genuine principle versus personal or factional interests, enabling him to craft different approaches for different types of resistance. For officials whose opposition was rooted in sincere beliefs about proper governmental procedures, Emperor Gaozong emphasized the practical benefits that Wu Zhao's elevation would provide for imperial administration. He highlighted her track record of successful policy contributions and argued that effective governance required him to surround himself with the most capable advisors and partners available, regardless of gender. For officials whose resistance seemed motivated primarily by factional loyalty or personal ambition, the emperor took a more confrontational approach, making it clear that continued opposition would be interpreted as disloyalty to imperial authority and treated accordingly. He began transferring some resistant officials to less important positions while promoting others who supported his marriage plans, sending clear signals about the consequences of different political choices. The ecclesiastical dimension of the opposition proved particularly challenging because it involved fundamental questions about the relationship between imperial authority and religious doctrine. Buddhist and Taoist religious leaders argued that elevating Wu Zhao to empress would violate spiritual principles governing the cosmic order, potentially bringing divine punishment upon the entire empire. Wu Zhao's response to religious opposition demonstrated her sophisticated understanding of how spiritual authority functioned in Chinese society. Rather than attacking religious leaders directly, she worked to divide them by promoting alternative interpretations of relevant doctrines and supporting religious figures who were willing to endorse her elevation. She commissioned new translations of Buddhist texts that emphasized compassion and wisdom over gender as the primary qualifications for political leadership. She funded Taoist scholars who argued that the cosmic balance required periodic reversals of traditional patterns, making female rule a necessary correction to excessive male dominance. She supported Confucian intellectuals who reinterpreted classical teachings about governance to focus on competence and virtue, rather than gender as the essential requirements for legitimate authority. These religious and philosophical debates created intellectual cover for officials and citizens who were personally inclined to support Wu Zhao, but needed justification for abandoning traditional beliefs about female political participation. The scholarly discussions provided them with respectable arguments they could use to explain their support for unprecedented changes in imperial protocol. The international implications of Wu Zhao's elevation also required careful management, as neighboring kingdoms and tributary states were closely watching developments in the Tang court for signs of weakness or instability that they might exploit. Any perception that the Chinese empire was experiencing internal chaos or illegitimate leadership could trigger foreign invasions or rebellions in border regions. Wu Zhao addressed these concerns by emphasizing continuity in foreign policy and military preparedness. She worked with Emperor Gaozong to ensure that diplomatic communications with foreign courts stressed the stability and strength of Tang administration, rather than the unprecedented nature of the imperial marriage changes. She coordinated with military commanders to maintain high levels of readiness along frontier regions, demonstrating that governmental transitions would not create opportunities for external aggression. Her approach to international relations during this period revealed her understanding that foreign perceptions of Chinese strength were as important as domestic political support for the success of her elevation. Any sign of weakness or internal division could invite external challenges that would complicate her consolidation of power and potentially provide opportunities for her domestic enemies to rally opposition around national security concerns. By autumn 656, the various elements of Wu Zhao's campaign were beginning to converge into a decisive moment when Emperor Gaozong would need to make final decisions about proceeding with the divorce and remarriage. The political, military, religious, and international preparations had created conditions that made her elevation feasible, but the actual implementation would still require navigating enormous risks and potential complications. The timing of the final decision was influenced by several factors that were beyond Wu Zhao's direct control, but that she had anticipated and prepared for during her strategic planning. Empress Wang's supporters were becoming increasingly desperate as they recognized the trajectory of events, making them more likely to attempt dramatic countermeasures that could either derail Wu Zhao's campaign or provide justification for accelerating it. Court gossip and speculation about the emperor's intentions had reached levels that were making it difficult to maintain operational security around the marriage plans. Too many officials and court observers were aware that major changes were being considered, creating pressure to either implement the plans quickly or abandon them to prevent information leaks that could be exploited by opponents. Most importantly, Wu Zhao's own position was becoming increasingly precarious as her enemies recognized that they were running out of time to prevent her elevation. The longer she remained in her current ambiguous status, the more vulnerable she became to preemptive attacks designed to eliminate her before she could acquire the legal protections that would come with formal recognition as Empress. The convergence of these factors created a situation where delay was becoming more dangerous than action, forcing Wu Zhao and Emperor Gaozong to accelerate their timeline and prepare for the final confrontation that would determine not just her personal fate, but the future structure of imperial power in China. The decisive moment arrived in late 656, when Emperor Gaozong announced his intention to convene a formal imperial council to consider changes in the imperial marriage arrangements. This announcement transformed months of behind-the-scenes maneuvering into a public political crisis that would require all parties to declare their positions openly and accept the consequences of their choices. Wu Zhao understood that this council meeting would be the culmination of everything she had worked toward for over a decade. Success would make her empress and provide her with unprecedented power to reshape Chinese society according to her vision. Failure would likely result in her exile or execution, along with the destruction of everyone who had supported her ambitions. The stakes could not have been higher, and the outcome would depend on her ability to manage complex political dynamics under enormous pressure while maintaining the appearance of humble deference that was still expected from women in imperial Chinese society. She would need to be simultaneously bold and subtle, confident and deferential, commanding and respectful, as she navigated the most important political performance of her extraordinary career. The Imperial Council that would determine Wu Zhao's fate was scheduled to convene in the magnificent Hall of Supreme Harmony, where the most important decisions in Chinese imperial history had been made for generations. The symbolism was unmistakable. Wu Zhao's elevation would either be recorded as a legitimate continuation of imperial tradition or condemned as a dangerous violation of fundamental governmental principles. Everything now depended on her ability to convince the assembled officials, military commanders, and religious leaders that her unprecedented transformation from concubine to empress represented not a revolutionary break with Chinese tradition, but rather its natural and necessary evolution in response to contemporary challenges and opportunities. The woman who had entered the imperial court as a powerless teenager was about to discover whether her intelligence, ambition, and political skills were sufficient to achieve the impossible dream of supreme power in the world's most traditional and hierarchical society. The Imperial Council convened on a cold December morning in 656, with representatives from every major faction in Chinese government, gathering in the Hall of Supreme Harmony. Wu Zhao had spent the previous weeks in careful preparation, but she understood that no amount of planning could fully prepare her for the unprecedented nature of what she was attempting to accomplish. The assembled officials represented a cross-section of Tang dynasty power structures, each group bringing their own perspectives and interests to the deliberations. Military commanders sat alongside Confucian scholars, Buddhist monks debated with Taoist priests, and provincial governors mingled with court bureaucrats. The diversity of viewpoints ensured that every possible argument for and against Wu Zhao's elevation would be thoroughly examined. Emperor Gaozong opened the proceedings with a carefully prepared speech that emphasized the practical challenges facing imperial administration and the need for innovative solutions to unprecedented problems. He avoided directly mentioning Wu Zhao's candidacy, instead focusing on abstract principles about the importance of selecting the most qualified individuals for crucial governmental positions, regardless of traditional limitations or conventional expectations. The emperor's approach was strategically sound but politically risky. By framing the discussion in terms of governmental efficiency rather than personal preference, he invited detailed scrutiny of Wu Zhao's qualifications and track record. This examination could either vindicate her claims to exceptional competence or expose weaknesses that her enemies could exploit to undermine her candidacy. The first phase of the council debates focused on historical precedents for imperial marriage arrangements and the legal procedures governing changes in imperial family structure. Conservative officials argued that established protocols existed for good reasons and should not be altered without compelling justification that outweighed potential risks to dynastic stability. Wu Zhao's supporters responded by presenting the scholarly research she had commissioned over the previous months, demonstrating that imperial marriage practices had evolved significantly throughout Chinese history in response to changing political circumstances. They argued that flexibility and adaptation were actually traditional imperial virtues rather than dangerous innovations. The historical debate revealed the sophisticated intellectual preparation that Wu Zhao had undertaken to support her candidacy. Her research team had uncovered numerous examples of emperors who had modified marriage arrangements for political or administrative reasons, creating precedents that could be cited to justify contemporary changes. More importantly, they had identified classical texts that could be interpreted as supporting meritocratic selection of imperial partners based on capability rather than birth or convention. The second phase of the council discussions addressed the practical implications of Wu Zhao's elevation for imperial administration and governmental effectiveness. This topic played directly to her strengths, as she had spent years demonstrating her administrative competence and policy insights through measurable contributions to successful government initiatives. Military commanders testified about Wu Zhao's valuable contributions to strategic planning and logistics management, describing specific examples where her recommendations had improved operational outcomes and reduced costs. Provincial governors explained how her economic insights had helped them implement more effective tax collection and agricultural development programs. Court officials acknowledged her superior understanding of bureaucratic procedures and interfactional dynamics. This testimony was particularly powerful because it came from practical administrators who had worked directly with Wu Zhao and could speak from personal experience about her capabilities. Their endorsements carried more weight than abstract theoretical arguments because they were based on documented results rather than speculation about potential outcomes. However, Wu Zhao's opponents also presented compelling evidence about the risks associated with her elevation. They argued that promoting a woman to empress would set dangerous precedents that could destabilize traditional social hierarchies and encourage inappropriate ambitions among other women throughout the empire. They warned that foreign kingdoms might interpret female rule as evidence of Chinese weakness and become more aggressive in their territorial ambitions. The religious dimension of the opposition proved particularly challenging because it involved fundamental questions about cosmic order and divine approval for governmental arrangements. Buddhist leaders argued that elevating Wu Zhao would violate principles about proper relationships between masculine and feminine energies that governed both spiritual and political realms. Confucian scholars maintained that female rule contradicted natural law and would inevitably lead to social chaos and dynastic collapse. Wu Zhao's response to these religious objections demonstrated her sophisticated understanding of how spiritual authority functioned in imperial politics. Rather than directly challenging established doctrines, she worked through allied religious figures to present alternative interpretations that supported her candidacy while maintaining respect for traditional teachings. The Buddhist monks she had cultivated argued that compassion and wisdom were more important than gender for effective leadership, citing examples from Buddhist literature of female figures who had achieved enlightenment and provided guidance for entire communities. The Taoist priests in her coalition emphasized concepts about balance and change, suggesting that periodic reversals of traditional patterns were necessary to maintain cosmic harmony. The Confucian scholars she supported focused on classical teachings about virtue and competence as the primary qualifications for legitimate authority. These religious debates created space for officials who were personally inclined to support Wu Zhao, but needed intellectual justification for abandoning conventional beliefs about female political participation. The scholarly discussions provided them with respectable arguments they could use to explain their support for unprecedented changes in imperial protocol, without appearing to reject fundamental cultural values. The third phase of the council proceedings addressed the international implications of Wu Zhao's elevation and the potential responses from neighboring kingdoms and tributary states. This discussion was particularly important because any perception of Chinese weakness or instability could trigger foreign invasions or rebellions in border regions that might destabilize the entire empire. Wu Zhao had prepared extensively for this line of questioning by coordinating with military commanders and diplomatic officials to develop comprehensive assessments of foreign threats and appropriate countermeasures. She was able to demonstrate detailed knowledge of international relations and strategic planning that impressed even skeptical officials who had questioned her qualifications for imperial responsibilities. Her analysis of foreign policy challenges revealed understanding that went far beyond what most court officials possessed about complex relationships with Korean kingdoms, Turkish tribes, and Central Asian trading partners. She could discuss military logistics, economic dependencies, and cultural factors that influenced diplomatic negotiations, with a sophistication that reflected years of serious study and practical experience. More importantly, Wu Zhao presented specific proposals for strengthening Chinese international position that addressed legitimate concerns about potential foreign exploitation of imperial transitions. Her recommendations included military reforms, diplomatic initiatives, and economic policies that would demonstrate imperial strength and continuity, regardless of changes in domestic political arrangements. The international policy discussions also provided Wu Zhao with opportunities to highlight her unique qualifications for managing complex governmental challenges that required both analytical intelligence and practical administrative experience. She was able to demonstrate that her elevation would strengthen rather than weaken Chinese capabilities for dealing with foreign threats and opportunities. As the council debates continued over several days, the political dynamics became increasingly clear to all participants. Wu Zhao had successfully built a coalition of military commanders, provincial administrators, younger court officials, and allied religious figures who supported her candidacy based on demonstrated competence and practical benefits. Her opponents consisted primarily of conservative aristocratic families, traditional religious authorities, and older bureaucrats who prioritized conventional procedures over innovative approaches to governance. The numerical balance between these factions was roughly equal, which meant that the final decision would depend on the positions taken by moderate officials who were genuinely undecided about the best course of action. These individuals were primarily concerned with maintaining imperial stability and effectiveness, rather than advancing particular ideological or factional agendas. Wu Zhao's strategy for winning over the moderate faction involved emphasizing continuity and gradual reform rather than revolutionary change. She presented her elevation as a natural evolution of existing imperial practices rather than a dramatic break with traditional procedures. She stressed her commitment to working within established governmental structures while making incremental improvements to administrative efficiency and policy effectiveness. This approach was designed to reassure moderate officials that supporting her candidacy would not require them to abandon fundamental beliefs about proper governmental procedures or social organization. Wu Zhao wanted to appear as a competent administrator who happened to be female rather than as a feminist revolutionary who was using her gender to challenge traditional authority structures. The final day of council proceedings featured direct testimony from Wu Zhao herself, providing her with the opportunity to present her case personally to the assembled officials. This appearance was unprecedented in Chinese imperial history, as no woman had ever addressed a formal governmental council on matters of such fundamental importance to dynastic succession and imperial authority. Wu Zhao's presentation was masterfully crafted to address every major concern that had been raised during the previous debates while demonstrating the intelligence, dignity, and administrative competence that justified her unprecedented elevation. She began by acknowledging the extraordinary nature of her candidacy and expressing deep respect for the traditions and principles that had guided Chinese governance for centuries. From this foundation of humility and respect, she gradually built a compelling argument for why contemporary challenges required innovative approaches that built upon rather than rejected traditional wisdom. Wu Zhao emphasized that her administrative experience and policy insights represented resources that could strengthen imperial government and better serve the interests of the Chinese people. She addressed religious concerns by demonstrating sophisticated understanding of Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucian teachings, while presenting interpretations that supported rather than contradicted her candidacy. Her theological arguments were carefully constructed to show respect for established doctrines, while highlighting alternative readings that emphasized competence and virtue over gender as the primary qualifications for political authority. Wu Zhao's discussion of international relations revealed detailed knowledge of foreign policy challenges and specific proposals for maintaining Chinese strength and influence in regional affairs. She was able to demonstrate that her elevation would enhance rather than diminish imperial capabilities for dealing with external threats and opportunities. Most importantly, Wu Zhao presented a comprehensive vision for imperial administration that emphasized continuity with established procedures while incorporating innovations that would improve governmental effectiveness and better serve imperial interests. Her proposals were practical and specific, rather than abstract or ideological, demonstrating that she had given serious thought to the actual responsibilities and challenges associated with imperial authority. The personal testimony concluded with Wu Zhao's direct appeal to the assembled officials to support her candidacy based on demonstrated competence and potential contributions to imperial success, rather than on abstract principles about traditional gender roles or conventional political procedures. She argued that effective governance required selecting the most qualified individuals for crucial positions regardless of precedent or convention. Her presentation was followed by additional questioning from council members who wanted clarification about specific aspects of her background, qualifications, and policy proposals. These exchanges provided Wu Zhao with additional opportunities to demonstrate her knowledge and administrative capabilities, while addressing lingering concerns about her suitability for imperial responsibilities. The questioning period revealed the depth of preparation that Wu Zhao had undertaken for this crucial moment in her political career. She was able to provide detailed responses to technical questions about military strategy, economic policy, administrative procedures, and diplomatic relations that impressed even skeptical officials who had questioned her qualifications for imperial authority. More importantly, her responses demonstrated the analytical intelligence and practical wisdom that had enabled her to make valuable contributions to imperial administration over the previous years. Officials could see firsthand the capabilities that had made her such an effective advisor to Emperor Gaozong, and understand why he considered her partnership essential for successful governance. After 5 days of intensive deliberations, the Imperial Council concluded its formal sessions and prepared to deliver recommendations to Emperor Gaozong about Wu Zhao's candidacy for elevation to Empress. The final vote was closer than her supporters had hoped, but sufficient to provide the political legitimacy necessary for proceeding with unprecedented changes to imperial marriage arrangements. The Council's formal recommendation emphasized Wu Zhao's demonstrated administrative competence, policy insights, and potential contributions to imperial effectiveness, while acknowledging the unprecedented nature of her elevation and the importance of careful implementation to maintain governmental stability. The document provided Emperor Gaozong with the political cover necessary to proceed with his preferred course of action, while establishing expectations for how the transition would be managed. Wu Zhao's reaction to the council's decision was characteristically controlled and strategic. She expressed appropriate gratitude for the confidence placed in her, while emphasizing her commitment to serving imperial interests and maintaining governmental stability during the transition period. Her public statements were carefully crafted to reassure moderate supporters while avoiding triumphalism that might provoke renewed opposition from defeated factions. The immediate aftermath of the council decision created new challenges and opportunities that would test Wu Zhao's ability to consolidate her victory and begin the process of transforming her formal elevation into effective political authority. Success in the council debates was only the first step in a longer process of establishing herself as a legitimate and effective empress who could command respect and obedience from governmental institutions throughout the empire. The implementation phase would require Wu Zhao to demonstrate that her elevation was beneficial for imperial administration and Chinese society rather than merely a personal triumph that served her individual ambitions. She would need to deliver on the promises made during the council proceedings, while navigating the complex political dynamics created by her unprecedented transformation from concubine to empress. But Wu Zhao had spent over a decade preparing for exactly these challenges, and she possessed the intelligence, experience, and political skills necessary to succeed where no woman in Chinese history had ever been given the opportunity to try. Her remarkable journey from powerless teenager to potential empress was about to enter its most crucial phase, as she attempted to transform unprecedented formal authority into the practical power necessary to reshape an empire according to her extraordinary vision. The winter of 657 would determine whether Wu Zhao's elevation represented the beginning of a new era in Chinese political history, or merely an ambitious experiment that would end in failure and disgrace. Everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, and everything she had accomplished now depended on her ability to prove that a woman could not only survive at the pinnacle of imperial power, but actually excel in ways that would benefit the entire empire and justify the revolutionary changes she had fought so hard to achieve. The teenage concubine who had entered the Forbidden City with nothing but intelligence and determination was about to discover whether those qualities were sufficient to succeed in the ultimate test of political leadership in the most powerful empire on earth. The formal ceremony proclaiming Wu Zhao as Empress Wu took place on a frigid January morning in 657, transforming the Hall of Supreme Harmony into the stage for the most revolutionary moment in Chinese imperial history. The elaborate ritual had been meticulously planned to emphasize continuity with traditional procedures, while subtly acknowledging the unprecedented nature of what was occurring. Hundreds of court officials, military commanders, and foreign diplomats filled the magnificent hall, their silk robes creating a sea of brilliant colors against the backdrop of golden pillars and jade decorations. The ceremony itself followed ancient protocols that had been used for imperial marriages throughout Chinese history, but everyone present understood they were witnessing something that had never happened before and might never happen again. Emperor Gaozong, resplendent in his dragon robes and ceremonial crown, formally proclaimed Wu Zhao as his empress and partner in governing the Tang Empire. The words echoed through the hall with an authority that made the unprecedented seem inevitable, transforming months of political controversy into historical fact through the power of imperial declaration. Wu Zhao, now Empress Wu, received the golden phoenix crown and jade seal that symbolized her new status with perfect dignity and composure. Her acceptance speech was brief and carefully crafted to emphasize her gratitude, humility, and commitment to serving imperial interests. She made no reference to the extraordinary nature of her elevation or the opposition she had overcome to achieve it. But beneath the ceremonial formality, everyone present recognized the magnitude of what had just occurred. A woman who had entered the imperial court as a powerless concubine had systematically transformed herself into the most powerful person in the Chinese empire after the emperor himself. Her elevation represented not just a personal triumph, but a fundamental challenge to assumptions about gender, power, and political authority that had governed Chinese society for over 1,000 years. The immediate aftermath of the coronation ceremony revealed both the opportunities and dangers that Empress Wu would face in her new position. Congratulations poured in from officials and military commanders who had supported her candidacy. But these expressions of loyalty were often accompanied by requests for favors, appointments, and policy changes that reflected their expectations about how imperial gratitude should be expressed. More ominously, several prominent court officials who had opposed her elevation submitted formal requests for retirement or transfer to remote provincial positions, signaling their unwillingness to serve under female authority, despite the emperor's explicit endorsement of her status. These resignations created immediate administrative challenges, while also providing Empress Wu with opportunities to replace potentially disloyal subordinates, with officials more committed to her success. The international response to Wu Zhao's elevation was mixed but generally cautious, reflecting foreign uncertainty about how this unprecedented development might affect Chinese military capabilities and diplomatic relationships. Korean kingdoms suspended planned tribute missions while they assessed whether female rule represented Chinese weakness that could be exploited. Turkish tribal leaders increased raids along the northern frontier, testing imperial resolve under new leadership arrangements. These foreign challenges required immediate attention and decisive responses that would demonstrate the continuity of Chinese strength, regardless of changes in imperial family structure. Empress Wu understood that any perception of weakness or hesitation could trigger broader international crises that would undermine her domestic political position, while potentially threatening the security of the empire itself. Her response to these challenges revealed the strategic thinking and administrative competence that had enabled her remarkable rise to power. Rather than allowing military commanders to respond independently to foreign provocations, Empress Wu coordinated a comprehensive strategy that combined diplomatic initiatives with carefully calibrated military actions, designed to discourage aggression while avoiding unnecessary escalation. She personally reviewed intelligence reports about foreign military preparations, consulted with experienced generals about appropriate countermeasures, and crafted diplomatic messages that emphasized Chinese resolve while leaving room for face-saving retreats by potential enemies. This hands-on approach to foreign policy management demonstrated her genuine understanding of strategic planning while establishing her authority over military and diplomatic bureaucracies. The Korean situation was particularly delicate because it involved complex historical relationships and competing territorial claims that could easily escalate into full-scale warfare if mismanaged. Several Korean kingdoms had been vassals of the Chinese Empire for generations, providing tribute and military assistance in exchange for protection and trading privileges. However, the succession of a female empress had created uncertainty about whether these arrangements would continue under new leadership. Empress Wu's approach to the Korean challenge was characteristically sophisticated and multi-layered. She began by dispatching experienced diplomats to Korean courts with personal messages emphasizing her commitment to maintaining traditional relationships while also hinting at potential benefits for kingdoms that demonstrated continued loyalty. These diplomatic initiatives were accompanied by subtle military preparations that would enable rapid deployment of Chinese forces if diplomatic solutions proved insufficient. More importantly, she used the Korean situation as an opportunity to demonstrate her strategic capabilities to domestic audiences who were still evaluating her qualifications for imperial authority. By successfully managing complex international negotiations while maintaining imperial dignity and Chinese interests, Empress Wu could prove that female leadership was not only feasible, but potentially superior to conventional approaches that relied primarily on military intimidation. The Turkish frontier presented different, but equally significant challenges that required careful balancing of competing priorities and limited resources. Turkish tribal confederations had been launching increasingly ambitious raids into Chinese territory, testing imperial defenses and seeking opportunities to establish permanent settlements in border regions. These incursions threatened both Chinese security and imperial prestige, demanding responses that would deter future aggression without provoking larger conflicts that could strain imperial resources. Empress Wu's strategy for dealing with Turkish threats involved a combination of military, diplomatic and economic initiatives that reflected her comprehensive understanding of the factors driving tribal behavior. She recognized that Turkish raids were motivated primarily by economic desperation rather than territorial ambition, creating opportunities for solutions that addressed underlying causes rather than merely responding to immediate symptoms. Her approach began with enhanced intelligence, gathering about tribal leadership, internal conflicts, and resource needs that might be influencing decisions about raiding Chinese territory. This information enabled more targeted responses that could exploit divisions among different tribal groups while offering incentives for cooperation with Chinese authorities. Simultaneously, Empress Wu initiated economic programs designed to provide Turkish tribes with legitimate alternatives to raiding as sources of income and resources. These initiatives included expanded trading opportunities, employment in Chinese military units, and access to Chinese agricultural techniques that could improve tribal food security. The programs were carefully structured to create dependencies that would discourage future aggression while demonstrating Chinese generosity and strength. The military dimension of her Turkish strategy emphasized mobility, intelligence, and psychological impact rather than massive force deployment that would be expensive and potentially counterproductive. Empress Wu worked with experienced frontier commanders to develop new tactics that could neutralize Turkish advantages in cavalry warfare, while exploiting Chinese superiority in logistics, coordination, and technological resources. These military innovations included improved communication systems that enabled faster responses to tribal movements, enhanced fortification designs that could withstand cavalry attacks while supporting Chinese counteroffensives, and new weapons technologies that gave Chinese forces tactical advantages in the types of engagements most common along the Turkish frontier. The success of Empress Wu's foreign policy initiatives during her first months in power provided powerful evidence of her competence and effectiveness that helped consolidate her domestic political position. Officials who had questioned her qualifications for imperial authority found it increasingly difficult to maintain their opposition when her policies were producing measurable improvements in imperial security and international relations. More importantly, her foreign policy successes created opportunities for Empress Wu to begin implementing domestic reforms that would strengthen her political coalition while addressing long-standing problems in Chinese governmental administration. The credibility she gained through effective management of international challenges provided her with political capital that could be invested in more controversial domestic initiatives. The first major area of domestic reform that Empress Wu addressed was the imperial bureaucracy itself, which had become increasingly dominated by a small number of aristocratic families whose members passed government positions between generations regardless of competence or merit. This system created inefficiencies and corruption that undermined governmental effectiveness, while limiting opportunities for talented individuals from diverse backgrounds. Empress Wu's approach to bureaucratic reform was gradual and strategic, designed to improve administrative performance while avoiding direct confrontation with established families whose opposition could destabilize her political position. She began by expanding examination systems that allowed individuals to qualify for government service based on demonstrated knowledge and capabilities rather than family connections or aristocratic status. These examination reforms were presented as efforts to strengthen imperial administration by ensuring that the most qualified candidates were selected for important positions. The changes appeared to be motivated by concern for governmental efficiency rather than by desire to challenge traditional social hierarchies, making them more palatable to conservative officials who might otherwise oppose innovations that threatened established privileges. The expanded examination system created new opportunities for individuals from merchant, artisan, and farming families to enter government service, gradually diversifying the social composition of the imperial bureaucracy. This diversification strengthened Empress Wu's political coalition by creating a class of officials who owed their positions to her reforms rather than to traditional aristocratic networks. More subtly, The examination reforms allowed Empress Wu to identify and promote talented individuals who were likely to be loyal to her personally because their career advancement depended on her continued support. These officials formed the nucleus of a new administrative elite that was more meritocratic and less bound by traditional factional loyalties than the existing bureaucratic establishment. The second major area of domestic reform addressed economic policies that affected agricultural production, commercial development, and tax collection throughout the empire. The existing system had evolved over centuries to serve the interests of large landowners and established merchant families, often at the expense of small farmers and independent traders who form the majority of the Chinese population. Empress Wu recognized that economic reforms could simultaneously improve imperial revenues, strengthen popular support for her government, and weaken the political influence of aristocratic families, whose power was based largely on their control of agricultural land and commercial networks. However, implementing such reforms required careful planning and gradual implementation to avoid triggering economic disruption that could destabilize the entire empire. Her economic strategy began with improvements to infrastructure that would benefit all social classes, while creating new opportunities for government oversight of commercial activities. These projects included expansion of the canal system that connected different regions of the empire, construction of new roads that facilitated trade and communication, and development of standardized currency systems that reduced transaction costs and simplified tax collection. The infrastructure programs were popular with merchants and farmers who benefited from reduced transportation costs and expanded market access, while also providing Empress Wu with legitimate reasons to place government officials in positions where they could monitor economic activities and ensure compliance with imperial policies. This oversight capability would prove essential for implementing more controversial reforms that redistributed economic opportunities and political influence. Simultaneously, Empress Wu began experimenting with new approaches to agricultural taxation that reduced burdens on small farmers while ensuring that large landowners paid appropriate shares of imperial revenues. These tax reforms were presented as efforts to improve collection efficiency and reduce administrative costs, rather than as attempts to redistribute wealth or challenge existing social hierarchies. The agricultural tax experiments were conducted initially in selected provinces, where Empress Wu had strong political support and reliable administrative personnel who could implement complex new procedures without triggering significant opposition. The results of these pilot programs provided valuable information about the practical implications of different policy approaches, while demonstrating the potential benefits of more comprehensive reforms. The success of the pilot programs encouraged Empress Wu to expand agricultural tax reforms to additional provinces, while also beginning to address commercial taxation policies that affected merchants and artisans. These commercial reforms were designed to encourage economic development and innovation, while ensuring that imperial revenues reflected the growing importance of trade and manufacturing in the Chinese economy. The third major area of domestic reform involved legal and judicial procedures that governed how disputes were resolved and how criminal cases were prosecuted throughout the empire. The existing legal system was complex and often inconsistent, with different procedures applying to different social classes and different types of cases. This complexity created opportunities for corruption and manipulation, while making it difficult for ordinary citizens to understand their rights and obligations under imperial law. Empress Wu's approach to legal reform emphasized standardization, transparency, and accessibility, rather than fundamental changes to the principles underlying Chinese jurisprudence. She wanted to make the legal system more efficient and equitable, without challenging basic assumptions about imperial authority or social hierarchy that provided the foundation for governmental legitimacy. The legal reforms began with comprehensive reviews of existing laws and procedures to identify inconsistencies, redundancies, and gaps that created confusion or enabled abuse. These reviews were conducted by teams of scholars and experienced judges who were tasked with developing recommendations for improvements that would enhance both fairness and efficiency in legal proceedings. The review process revealed numerous problems with existing legal procedures that were undermining public confidence in imperial justice while creating administrative burdens that consumed excessive governmental resources. Many laws were outdated or contradictory. Enforcement procedures varied significantly between different regions, and appeal processes were so complex that only wealthy individuals could effectively challenge unfavorable decisions. Empress Wu's response to these problems involved systematic revision of legal codes to eliminate contradictions and simplify procedures while maintaining appropriate protections for both individual rights and imperial authority. The revised codes were designed to be more accessible to ordinary citizens, while also providing clearer guidance to judges and administrative officials about proper procedures and appropriate penalties. The legal reforms also included improvements to judicial training and evaluation systems that would ensure more consistent application of laws throughout the empire. Judges were required to demonstrate competence in both legal knowledge and practical decision-making skills before being appointed to important positions, while regular performance reviews ensured that judicial officials maintained appropriate standards of competence and integrity. These judicial improvements were particularly important for Empress Wu's political position because they demonstrated her commitment to fairness and good governance, while also creating systems that could protect her supporters from politically motivated prosecutions by hostile officials. The reformed legal system provided both practical benefits for Chinese citizens and strategic advantages for maintaining her political coalition. The fourth major area of domestic reform addressed military organization and strategic planning systems that were essential for maintaining imperial security while supporting foreign policy objectives. The existing military structure had evolved over centuries to address different types of threats and challenges, creating a complex system of overlapping commands and competing priorities that sometimes hindered effective responses to contemporary security problems. Empress Wu's military reforms were designed to improve coordination between different military units while maintaining the regional autonomy that allowed rapid responses to local threats. She recognized that excessive centralization could create vulnerabilities if communication systems were disrupted, but also understood that insufficient coordination could prevent effective responses to large-scale challenges that required integrated strategies. Her approach to military reform began with comprehensive assessments of existing capabilities, threat environments, and resource requirements that would provide accurate information about current strengths and weaknesses in imperial defense systems. These assessments were conducted by experienced military professionals who could provide objective evaluations without being influenced by factional politics or personal interests. The military assessments revealed both significant capabilities and important vulnerabilities in Chinese defense systems that required immediate attention. Imperial forces were generally well-equipped and professionally trained, but coordination between different commands was often inadequate, and strategic planning processes were sometimes compromised by political considerations that interfered with military judgment. Empress Wu's response to these military challenges involved gradual improvements to command structures, communication systems, and strategic planning procedures that would enhance effectiveness without creating disruption during the reform process. The military reforms were implemented carefully to maintain operational readiness while upgrading capabilities and addressing identified weaknesses. The military improvements included new training programs that emphasized coordination between different types of units, enhanced intelligence systems that provided better information about potential threats, and improved logistics capabilities that could support more complex operations over greater distances. These reforms strengthened Chinese military capabilities, while also creating new opportunities for talented officers to advance based on demonstrated competence rather than political connections. More importantly, the military reforms established Empress Wu's authority over imperial armed forces in ways that would be essential for maintaining her political position against potential challenges from domestic opponents or foreign enemies. Military commanders who benefited from her reforms became stakeholders in her continued success. creating powerful incentives for loyalty and support during future political crises. The cumulative effect of Empress Wu's domestic reforms during her first year as empress was to strengthen both the practical effectiveness of imperial government and her personal political position within the complex hierarchy of Chinese power structures. Each reform area reinforced the others, creating synergistic improvements that demonstrated the benefits of comprehensive rather than piecemeal approaches to governmental innovation. The bureaucratic reforms improved administrative efficiency while creating new sources of political support among officials whose careers benefited from expanded opportunities for advancement. The economic reforms strengthened imperial revenues while building popular support among farmers and merchants who experienced tangible improvements in their economic circumstances. The legal reforms enhanced public confidence in imperial justice while providing protections for Empress Wu's political coalition. The military reforms strengthened imperial security while establishing her authority over armed forces. These interconnected improvements provided powerful evidence that female leadership could not only function effectively within Chinese governmental systems, but could actually produce superior results compared to traditional approaches that relied primarily on precedent and conventional wisdom. The practical success of her policies made it increasingly difficult for opponents to argue that her elevation had been a mistake or that traditional gender restrictions should be restored. However, Empress Wu also understood that her reforms were creating new sources of opposition among individuals and groups whose interests were threatened by changes in existing systems. Aristocratic families were losing some of their traditional privileges. Conservative officials were uncomfortable with innovative approaches to governance, and some military commanders resented new oversight procedures that limited their autonomy. Managing this opposition while continuing to implement necessary reforms required Empress Wu to demonstrate both strength and flexibility in her approach to political leadership. She needed to show that resistance to her policies would be futile, while also providing face-saving opportunities for opponents who were willing to accept the new political realities she was creating. Her strategy for managing political opposition involved a combination of incentives and deterrents that were carefully calibrated to encourage cooperation while discouraging organized resistance. Officials who supported her reforms were rewarded with promotions, increased responsibilities, and access to imperial favor. Those who opposed her policies faced reduced influence, unfavorable assignments, and exclusion from important decision-making processes. More subtly, Empress Wu began using her expanding intelligence networks to gather information about potential conspiracies or organized opposition activities that might threaten her political position or the stability of her reforms. This intelligence capability allowed her to identify problems before they became serious threats, while also demonstrating to potential opponents that resistance would be detected and countered. The intelligence systems she developed were more sophisticated and comprehensive than anything previous Chinese rulers had employed, reflecting both her understanding of the unique challenges she faced as a female emperor and her recognition that maintaining power required constant vigilance against potential threats from multiple directions simultaneously. These intelligence capabilities would prove essential as Empress Wu's reforms began to generate the types of organized opposition that had destroyed previous attempts at governmental innovation in Chinese history. The combination of aristocratic resentment, conservative resistance, and foreign exploitation of domestic instability had toppled numerous dynasties and emperors who had attempted changes similar to those she was implementing. But Empress Wu possessed advantages that previous reformers had lacked, including unprecedented popular support, military loyalty, and administrative competence that enabled her to anticipate and counter threats that might otherwise have proven fatal to her political survival. The intelligence networks, reformed bureaucracy, strengthened military and improved legal system created multiple layers of protection that would be tested repeatedly during the challenging years ahead. The winter of 658 marked the end of Empress Wu's first full year in power and the beginning of a new phase in her remarkable political career. She had successfully consolidated her authority, implemented significant reforms, and demonstrated that female leadership could produce exceptional results in governing the world's largest and most complex empire. But the teenage concubine who had systematically transformed herself into China's most powerful woman understood that her greatest challenges still lay ahead. The reforms she had implemented were beginning to generate organized opposition that would require all her intelligence, experience, and political skill to overcome. The question was no longer whether a woman could succeed as empress, but whether even someone as extraordinary as Wu Zhao could maintain power against the forces that were gathering to destroy everything she had accomplished. The answer to that question would determine not only her personal fate, but the future direction of Chinese civilization and the role of women in political leadership for centuries to come. Everything she had learned during her incredible rise from powerless concubine to supreme authority was about to be tested in ways that would either establish her as one of history's greatest rulers or serve as a cautionary tale about the limits of individual ambition in traditional societies. The stage was set for the next phase of Wu Zhao's extraordinary journey, as the woman who had achieved the impossible prepared to discover whether her remarkable accomplishments could survive the ultimate test of sustained political leadership in the face of determined opposition from the most powerful forces in Chinese society. The years that followed would test every strategy Wu Zetian had mastered during her ascent to power, as the forces arrayed against her began to coalesce into organized resistance that threatened not just her reforms, but her very survival as emperor. By 659, the whispers in palace corridors had grown into open discussions among aristocratic families about the necessity of restoring traditional order to the empire. And these discussions were beginning to take on the character of conspiracy. The challenge Wu Zetian faced was fundamentally different from anything she had encountered during her rise to power. Previously, she had been fighting for advancement within existing systems, using her intelligence and political skills to navigate established hierarchies and win allies among people who already held positions of authority. Now, as emperor, she was simultaneously defending her position while trying to transform the very systems that had enabled her success. The aristocratic families who formed the core of opposition to her rule were not simply resisting individual policies or administrative changes. They were fighting to preserve a social order that had guaranteed their wealth, status, and political influence for generations. Wu Zetian's reforms threatened to replace hereditary privilege with merit-based advancement, undermining the fundamental assumptions about power and authority that these families had built their entire identities around. The Kui family, one of the most prominent aristocratic clans in the empire, began organizing what they called study groups to discuss classical texts and traditional governance principles. These gatherings, held in elegant private mansions throughout Chang'an, attracted dozens of court officials, retired generals, and influential scholars who shared concerns about the direction of imperial policy under female leadership. On the surface, these meetings appeared to be innocent, intellectual discussions about Confucian philosophy and historical precedents for proper governmental procedures. The participants carefully avoided direct criticism of Wu Zetian or explicit calls for resistance to her authority. Instead, they focused on abstract principles about natural order, traditional values, and the importance of maintaining continuity with ancestral wisdom. But beneath this facade of scholarly inquiry, the study groups were developing coordinated strategies for undermining Wu Zetian's reforms and eventually forcing her removal from power. The participants shared information about government policies, coordinated their responses to imperial initiatives, and began identifying potential military commanders who might support a restoration of traditional male leadership. Wu Zetian's intelligence networks detected these activities within weeks of their inception, providing her with detailed information about the participants, their discussions, and their evolving plans for organized resistance. The reports she received revealed not just the immediate threat posed by aristocratic opposition, but also the sophisticated nature of their approach to challenging her authority. Rather than attempting direct confrontation or open rebellion, which would have played to Wu Zetian's strengths in managing political crises, her opponents were pursuing a strategy of gradual erosion designed to weaken her position over time while maintaining plausible deniability about their ultimate objectives. This approach was more dangerous than outright revolt because it was harder to counter without appearing paranoid or authoritarian. Wu Zetian's response to this emerging threat demonstrated both her political maturity and her understanding of the complex dynamics involved in maintaining imperial authority. She recognized that aggressive action against the study groups could backfire by providing her opponents with evidence that she was becoming a tyrant who suppressed legitimate intellectual discourse. But she also understood that allowing organized opposition to develop unchecked could eventually lead to challenges that would be much more difficult to overcome. Her solution involved a multi-layered strategy that combined subtle countermeasures with proactive initiatives designed to strengthen her position while weakening her opponents. She began by expanding her own networks of scholars and intellectuals who could provide alternative interpretations of the classical texts that aristocratic opponents were using to justify their resistance to her reforms. The scholarly initiatives Wu Zetian sponsored were carefully designed to appear as legitimate academic research rather than political propaganda. She funded conferences and publications that explored historical examples of successful governmental innovation, re-examined traditional teachings about leadership and authority, and developed new frameworks for understanding the relationship between effective governance and social change. These intellectual projects served multiple purposes in Wu Zetian's broader strategy for managing aristocratic opposition. They provided her supporters with sophisticated arguments that could counter the classical quotations and historical precedents that her opponents used to justify their resistance. They created opportunities for talented scholars to advance their careers by contributing to imperial initiatives, building loyalty among intellectual communities that might otherwise have been neutral or hostile. Most importantly, the scholarly projects established Wu Zetian as a patron of learning and cultural development, countering attempts to portray her as an illegitimate usurper who was destroying traditional Chinese civilization. Her support for intellectual inquiry and academic excellence demonstrated that her reforms were motivated by genuine concern for imperial welfare, rather than personal ambition or revolutionary ideology. Simultaneously, Wu Zetian began implementing more targeted measures designed to disrupt the coordination mechanisms that aristocratic families were using to organize their opposition. These measures were subtle and indirect, designed to appear as routine administrative adjustments rather than deliberate attempts to suppress political resistance. She initiated a series of bureaucratic reforms that required more frequent reporting and documentation of official activities, making it more difficult for government employees to participate in unauthorized political discussions without detection. New assignment procedures rotated officials between different departments and regions more frequently, preventing the formation of stable factional networks that could coordinate opposition activities over extended periods. Travel regulations were modified to require additional documentation and approval processes for journeys between major cities, making it more challenging for aristocratic families to maintain regular communication and coordination across different regions of the empire. These changes were presented as security measures designed to improve intelligence gathering about foreign threats, but they had the practical effect of limiting the ability of domestic opponents to organize large-scale resistance. The financial dimension of Wu Zetian's counter-strategy involved careful manipulation of government contracts, tax assessments, and trade privileges that affected the economic interests of aristocratic families. Rather than direct attacks on their wealth, which would have been obvious and potentially counterproductive, she implemented gradual changes that reduced their economic advantages while creating new opportunities for individuals and families who supported her reforms. Government procurement procedures were modified to emphasize competitive bidding and performance standards, rather than traditional relationships and family connections. Tax collection methods were standardized to reduce opportunities for preferential treatment based on aristocratic status. Trading privileges and commercial licenses were expanded to include more diverse applicants, reducing the monopolistic advantages that established families had enjoyed for generations. These economic measures were presented as efforts to improve governmental efficiency and increase imperial revenues rather than as a tax on aristocratic privilege. The changes appeared to be motivated by practical administrative concerns rather than political retaliation, making it difficult for opponents to rally broader support by claiming persecution or unfair treatment. The cumulative effect of these various countermeasures was to gradually weaken the organizational capabilities and economic resources that aristocratic families needed to sustain effective opposition to Wu Zetian's rule. The families found themselves increasingly isolated from each other, with reduced financial resources and limited access to the government positions and commercial opportunities that had traditionally provided the foundation for their political influence. But Wu Zetian understood that defensive measures alone would not be sufficient to secure her long-term position as emperor. She needed to build new sources of support that could replace the traditional aristocratic power structures she was systematically undermining. This required her to identify and cultivate alternative constituencies that had interests in maintaining and expanding her reforms. The most important of these alternative constituencies consisted of the growing class of officials who had advanced through the expanded examination systems that Wu Zetian had implemented during her first years as emperor. These individuals owed their positions to merit-based selection rather than family connections, making them natural allies of reforms that emphasized competence over hereditary privilege. Wu Zetian began systematically promoting examination-based officials to more important positions within the imperial bureaucracy, creating a new administrative elite that was personally invested in her continued success. These officials understood that their career prospects depended on maintaining the merit-based systems that had enabled their advancement, giving them powerful incentives to support Wu Zetian against challenges from traditional aristocratic families. The military dimension of Wu Zetian's coalition-building efforts focused on professional officers who valued competence and effectiveness over social status and family background. Many of these officers had benefited from the military reforms she had implemented, including improved training programs, better equipment and supplies, and promotion procedures that rewarded battlefield performance rather than aristocratic connections. Wu Zetian cultivated relationships with these professional officers by continuing to provide them with the resources and support they needed to maintain military effectiveness, while also offering them increased responsibilities and recognition for their contributions to imperial security. The officers who worked closely with her during this period developed genuine respect for her strategic intelligence and administrative capabilities, creating bonds of professional loyalty that transcended concerns about gender and traditional protocol. The economic constituencies that Wu Zetian courted included merchants, artisans, and farmers who had benefited from her reforms to commercial regulation, taxation policies, and infrastructure development. These groups represented a much larger portion of the Chinese population than aristocratic families, but they had traditionally been excluded from political participation and had limited influence over governmental policies. Wu Zetian's approach to building support among these economic constituencies involved both practical benefits and symbolic recognition that demonstrated her commitment to serving broader imperial interests rather than just elite preferences. The infrastructure projects she sponsored created employment opportunities and reduced transportation costs for merchants and artisans. The tax reforms she implemented reduced burdens on small farmers while ensuring that wealthy landowners paid appropriate shares of imperial revenues. More subtly, Wu Zetian began incorporating representatives of merchant and artisan communities into advisory roles within the imperial government, giving them formal channels for expressing their concerns and recommendations about policies that affected their economic activities. This inclusion was unprecedented in Chinese imperial history, where government service had traditionally been limited to scholars and aristocrats who could demonstrate mastery of classical literature and philosophical principles. The symbolic importance of including merchants and artisans in governmental processes was as significant as the practical benefits it provided. Wu Zetian was demonstrating that her administration valued productive economic activity and practical skills rather than just theoretical knowledge and social status. This message resonated powerfully with communities that had been marginalized by traditional political systems, despite their essential contributions to imperial prosperity and stability. Regional administrators represented another crucial constituency that Wu Zetian cultivated systematically during this period. Provincial governors and local officials who had implemented her reforms successfully had seen tangible improvements in their administrative effectiveness and their relationships with the populations they governed. These officials became natural advocates for expanding and continuing the reform programs that had enhanced their capabilities and improved their results. Wu Zetian maintained regular communication with successful regional administrators, seeking their advice about policy modifications and implementation strategies, while also providing them with recognition and rewards for their achievements. This relationship building created networks of experienced officials throughout the empire who had personal stakes in defending her reforms against attempts to restore traditional procedures that had been less effective. The religious dimension of Wu Zetian's coalition-building efforts involved continued cultivation of Buddhist and Taoist leaders who supported alternative interpretations of spiritual teachings about governance and political authority. The scholars and priests who had provided theological justification for her elevation to emperor continued to develop and refine their arguments, creating increasingly sophisticated frameworks for understanding female leadership as compatible with divine order and cosmic harmony. Wu Zetian's support for these religious scholars included funding for temple construction, sponsorship of scholarly conferences, and patronage of artistic and literary projects that explored themes related to wisdom, compassion, and effective leadership, regardless of gender. These activities strengthened her relationships with religious communities while also producing cultural works that influence broader public opinion about the legitimacy and benefits of her rule. By 661, Wu Zetian had successfully constructed a diverse coalition of supporters that included merit-based officials, professional military officers, economic constituencies, regional administrators, and progressive religious leaders. This coalition was more representative of Chinese society as a whole than the traditional aristocratic networks that had dominated imperial politics for centuries, giving her reforms a broader foundation of popular support. The strength of this coalition was tested during the autumn of 661, when aristocratic opposition to Wu Zetian's rule finally crystallized into organized conspiracy that threatened to overthrow her government through coordinated military action. The plot involved several prominent families, retired generals, and court officials who had concluded that gradual resistance was insufficient to restore traditional governmental procedures. The conspiracy was remarkably sophisticated, involving simultaneous uprisings in multiple provinces, coordinated attacks on government installations in the capital, and plans to assassinate Wu Zetian and key supporters of her administration. The conspirators had spent months recruiting military commanders, accumulating weapons and supplies, and developing communication networks that would enable coordinated action across vast distances. Wu Zetian's intelligence services detected the conspiracy during its final planning stages, providing her with detailed information about the participants, their objectives, and their operational plans. The intelligence reports revealed both the seriousness of the threat and the extensive preparation that had been undertaken by her opponents, confirming her assessment that aristocratic resistance had evolved into existential challenge to her continued rule. Her response to the conspiracy demonstrated both the political skills she had developed during her rise to power and the administrative capabilities she had built during her years as emperor. Rather than reacting defensively or allowing the conspirators to seize the initiative, Wu Zetian launched a comprehensive counter-offensive that turned their own preparations against them, while demonstrating the strength and effectiveness of her reformed governmental systems. The military response to the conspiracy was swift, coordinated, and decisive, reflecting the improvements in communication, logistics, and strategic planning that Wu Zetian had implemented during her military reforms. Professional officers who had benefited from her policies remained loyal to her government, providing reliable forces that could suppress uprisings while protecting key installations and personnel. The bureaucratic response involved rapid deployment of administrative resources to maintain governmental functions, while managing the disruption caused by removing conspirators from their positions. Merit-based officials stepped into increased responsibilities with competence and dedication, demonstrating that the reformed civil service could maintain stability even during major political crises. Most importantly, the popular response to the conspiracy revealed the depth of support that Wu Zetian had built among broader segments of Chinese society. Merchants, farmers, artisans, and regional officials who had benefited from her reforms actively assisted government efforts to suppress the uprising, providing intelligence, resources, and manpower that proved essential for defeating the conspiracy. The successful suppression of the aristocratic conspiracy marked a turning point in Wu Zetian's reign, establishing her authority on foundations that were far more secure than the personal relationships and factional alliances that had initially enabled her rise to power. She had proven that her reforms could not only improve governmental effectiveness, but also create sufficient popular support to survive organized challenges from traditional power structures. The aftermath of the conspiracy provided Wu Zetian with opportunities to accelerate and expand her reform programs while eliminating remaining sources of organized opposition to her rule. The conspirators' properties were confiscated and redistributed to support governmental programs. Their positions were filled by loyal officials who supported continued innovation, and their networks were replaced by new alliances based on shared commitment to effective governance rather than hereditary privilege. More significantly, the failed conspiracy demonstrated to potential opponents that resistance to Wu Zetian's reforms was not only futile, but actively dangerous to their personal interests and family welfare. The comprehensive nature of her intelligence capabilities, the loyalty of reformed military forces, and the breadth of popular support for her policies made organized opposition extremely risky while offering limited prospects for success. The years following the conspiracy saw Wu Zetian's transformation from a defensive ruler trying to preserve her position into a confident emperor, implementing increasingly ambitious programs designed to reshape Chinese society according to her vision of effective governance and social justice. The reforms she implemented during this period would establish precedents and create institutions that would influence Chinese development for centuries after her death. But the woman who had begun her journey as a powerless concubine and survived every challenge through intelligence, determination, and political skill understood that her ultimate legacy would depend not just on her success in maintaining power, but on her ability to create lasting changes that would benefit the Chinese people long after her remarkable reign had ended. The teenage girl who had entered the imperial court with nothing but ambition and intelligence had become the most powerful person in the world's largest empire, proving that exceptional individuals could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles through careful planning, strategic thinking, and unwavering commitment to their objectives. Her story stands as one of history's most extraordinary examples of personal transformation and political achievement, demonstrating that even in the most traditional and hierarchical societies, remarkable individuals could create revolutionary change through skillful application of intelligence, determination, and strategic vision. Wu Zetian's reign would continue for many more years, during which she would implement reforms that modernized Chinese government, strengthened imperial administration, and expanded opportunities for talented individuals regardless of their social background. Her achievements as emperor would ultimately overshadow the controversies surrounding her rise to power, establishing her as one of China's most effective and transformative rulers. The concubine who became emperor had accomplished something that no woman before or since has achieved in Chinese history, creating a legacy that continues to inspire and inform discussions about leadership, gender, and political possibility more than 13 centuries after her death. Her remarkable journey from powerless teenager to supreme authority remains one of history's most compelling stories of individual triumph over seemingly insurmountable obstacles, proving that intelligence, determination, and strategic vision can enable extraordinary individuals to achieve the impossible and transform the world around them.